Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. I will discuss something that someone just asked me recently. I felt like because the person is a member of the YouTube channel, so I thought maybe I should address it as quickly as possible. Okay, so someone has asked me a question. I think the person was watching the video on antibody panel. I can't remember, but I'm sure it should be an antibody panel that the person asked that question. Right, of course, thank you very much for asking the question. So the person has asked a question whether IAT is the same thing with indirect Coombs test. Right, I'm going to try to answer that very quickly. But before we continue, my name is Dr. Emmanuel Obodo. I'm a biomedical scientist, and I'm also a lecturer in biomedical science here in the United Kingdom. So let's look into what this person is asking. The person is asking, is IAT, which means indirect antiglobulin test, is it the same thing as indirect Coombs test? That's what the person is asking. In fact, let me answer it straight away. The answer is yes, they are the same. There's no difference. But just because it's my custom to always explain something to people, so I'll try to do that. Now, when you look at, because that question was asked on antibody, I think it should be a best way to start. I want you to think this way. I want you also, first of all, know that the antibodies are found where? Where do you normally see antibody? Ideally, antibody should be in the what? Extracellular environment, which should be your plasma or serum, as the case may be. That is where the antibody should be, okay? Now, why the antigen should be on the cell? Do you understand me? So when we talk about antigen, they are on the cell. When we talk about antibody, they are found in the plasma. By the way, this can be applied in immunology anywhere, but let me stick with hematology where this question was asked. Now, I want you to understand, first of all, that when you look at your whole blood, you have red blood cells. In fact, your whole blood, you have liquid part of the blood, then you have cell part of the blood. Antibodies are found on the liquid part of the blood, but antigens are found on the cell part of the blood. So that means there is red blood cell antigens, there are white blood cell antigens, there are platelet antigens as well. Does that make sense? Now, but in terms of what this person is asking, we are going to stay with red blood cells. Now, when we talk about blood grouping, most times we refer antigen A, antigen B, okay? Or we can say antibody A or antibody B. I'd already explained this on my previous video, but I just thought I should recap this. So when we say antigen A, antigen B, where they are found is on red blood cells. When you say antibody A or antibody B, where they are found is in the plasma. Do you understand? Now, if you have listened to my previous video, I think on ABO compatibility, I can't remember the title now, I was trying to explain to you guys that when you go for interview here, you need to understand when they are asking you questions around ABO compatibility, the question you need to ask yourself, which blood product are we talking about? Because if they ask you, which blood will you give someone who is maybe a blood group, okay? It's important that you know that what they are talking about that time is antigens, because the antigens are found on the cells. So red blood cell, because here we don't give whole blood, so we'll separate the blood into different components. So when they say which blood will you give, what they mean is red cell. What type of red cell will you give? So you should consider antigens. Now when they say which platelet or which FFP or which cryo will you give, don't think about antigen as it were. You should think about antibodies. Why? That antibody A, antibody B are found in the plasma, and in the plasma is where the, of course, FFP and of course cryoprecipitate is also produced from the plasma. Now, when we talk about platelet, ideally we should not consider antibody when we talk about platelet. But why do we consider antibody when we talk about platelet? I think I mentioned this on my previous video, but I can't remember the title now. So I told you guys that if you leave platelet, remember platelet is a cell. So if you leave the platelet, because it is what's the word now? Platelet, they are activated cells, and because they are activated cells, if you leave it like this, over time they will start being activated. and start forming clumping. Do you understand? Okay. So because we don't want the cells, the platelet now to form clump, so what we do is that when we separate the blood product and separate platelet, we separate platelet along with plasma. Does that make sense? So we now add plasma in our separation of platelet. So because of that, that plasma will help to keep the platelet floating. That way it cannot aggregate, it cannot clump. Does that make sense? So because of the presence of the plasma in the platelet, that is why when you go for interview, if they ask you what blood product will, or what type of blood will you give someone with a particular blood group or platelet, you should consider antibody, not antigen. Do you understand? Okay. Because when we talk about blood grouping, antigen A, antigen B, or antibody A, antibody B, or no antigen, or no antibody, as the case may be. Okay. Now, what that means that when we refer platelet is a thrombocyte, is a cell. Ideally, we should not talk about antibody, but we talk about antibody in platelet because of if we leave it without adding plasma, it will aggregate, it will clump. So we add plasma. So because of the presence of the plasma, that's what we consider antibody when we are looking at ABO compatibility in issuing platelet. Happy days. Right. So let me now answer this person's question. The reason why I went this route is this. It's important for us to understand why do we have to do IAT, the antibody. I've already said that IAT and IAT and indirect Coombs test, that means indirect antiglobulin test and indirect Coombs test, I've already said that they are the same. So that's just the straight answer to that question. But I want to give us strong background, okay? So why do we need to do IAT? Okay, I know you've been taught that blood group O does not have any antigen, and that is not correct. Now, what it means that when we're determining blood grouping, we focus on immunoglobulin M, IgM. So when you say antigen A, antigen B, antibody A, antibody B, what you are referring is IgM, immunoglobulin M, antigens and antibodies. Okay, but that does not negate, that does not relegate the fact that these blood groups, all of them, whether it is because in blood group O, they don't have this antigen A, they don't have this antigen B. But it's important that you know that even if blood group O does not have antigen A, does not have antigen B, that is correct. However, you cannot say that it doesn't have antigens. What you can say that it doesn't have IgM, antigen A, and antigen B. However, it does have other antigens. In fact, let me surprise you. Let me start this way. When you say blood group O positive, what you are saying is that for the fact you say blood group O positive, you are saying that that blood group O has antigen D. So the presence of antigen D makes a blood group positive. The absence of antigen D makes a blood group negative. Does that make sense, guys? Yeah. Right. So now you understood this. It means that every blood group has antigens. However, when you come to IgM, some of them has antigen A, some have antigen B, some have antigen A and B, some don't have antigen A or B. Do you understand the point? So in terms of IgM, antigen A and B, some doesn't have antigens like O. Okay. Now the same way, some doesn't have antibody like blood group AB. But I'm saying that when it comes to IgG antigens, immunoglobulin G antigens, every blood group has antigens. They have, all of them have, different IgG antigens. It will surprise you that when it comes to IgG antigens, it is not particularly respect of the particular blood group. Let me give you an example. Blood group A can have antigen big C. Blood group B can have antigen big C. Blood group AB can have antigen big C. Blood group O can have antigen big C. That means when it comes to IgG antigen, it's not particularly about the blood group. Let me also surprise you this way. Now, when you say blood group O, two blood group O, one can have antigen big C, another one may have antigen big, may not have antigen big C. In other words, one can be antigen big C positive, the other one can be antigen big C negative. Do you understand? So meaning that two the same blood group can have different IgG antigens. That's where I'm going. Okay. So now, if I have made this point clear, what it then means is this: when we give blood, especially during electronic issue, which I had mentioned on my previous video, there's a possibility that during electronic issue, which is computer cross-match, somebody may develop antibody. Okay, and when the person develop the antibody, obviously, which will cause hemolysis, okay, hemolytic of the newborn, and so many kinds of things will happen. That's, by the way, okay, I've already mentioned that on my previous video, okay. But the point there is this: so when somebody develop this antibody will go and stay in the plasma. But remember, when you gave the blood, you gave red blood cells. That is antigen. Now, if you give a blood that has, let's say, the same blood group A positive, blood group A positive, blood group A positive, this one is antigen big E negative. This one is antigen big E positive, but both of them are blood group A positive. So this is a patient, this is a donor. During electronic issue, because no historic antibody has a current group, and you give this blood that is antigen big E positive, but this one is antigen big E negative. If you give this blood to this blood group A, while in terms of the IgM antigens and antibodies, it is compatible, it is not compatible with the IgG antigens, because the recipient is antigen E negative and the donor is antigen E positive. That will cause sensitization, okay, and that will now lead to the production of what? Antibody, which can be found in the plasma. And that is why when the person come again, the antibody screening will then become positive. Then we can do antibody panel, and that is the I80. So now let me put it very simple like this. I80, this is very simple. I want to put it. When you say indirect globulin test or indirect Coombs test, what is the difference between I80 and D80? Or what's the difference between indirect Coombs test and direct Coombs test? Very simple. When you are measuring the antibodies on the surface of the red blood cell, antibodies should not be on the surface of the red blood cell. Antibodies should be in the plasma. But when you are trying to detect the presence of antibody on the red blood cells, that is direct, because that antibody is attaching directly on the red cells. So the process of detecting the antibody that attach directly on the red cells is D80, direct antiglobulin test or direct Coombs test. Now, but when you are measuring the antibody that are in the plasma, that is indirect. Do you understand me? Okay, it's indirect. So, and that is what happened. In fact, think about it this way: when a woman that is pregnant, if the woman has antibody, okay, that antibody is in the plasma, but that antibody can attach on the baby's red cells and cause hemolytic disease of the newborn. Okay, and that attachment, if you do antibody panel, you won't see that antibody. If you want to detect the antibody, you have to do D80. So when the antibody is on the surface of the red blood cells, if you do I80, you can't detect it. You may not, let me use the word, you may not detect it, okay? Now, what it means that there are two ways we can detect antibody, either by D80 or I80. With D80, we detect the antibodies. With D80, we detect the antibody on the surface of the red blood cells, okay, or cells. But with I80, we detect the antibodies in the plasma. I hope that makes sense. So I have tried to, in my attempt to answer whether there's a difference between I80 and indirect Coombs test, I've now given you guys the overview of how someone can develop antibody and what causes that. So this antibody in terms of I80 is mainly IgG antibodies. Do you understand me? These antibodies in terms of D80 are mainly IgG antigens, or sorry, antibodies, okay? So that is very, very important, okay? Now, of course, if you have studied the antibody panel, you see there are different antigens, okay? Now, let me say something extra here that I think is a good platform to say it. When you go for interview, sometimes they give you I80 and they say Enzyme. So you are confused. I want to also say whether it is enzyme panel, if you go for interview, whether they say IAT or they say enzyme, I want you to know that enzyme panel, okay, is still an IAT. Is still IAT. There's no difference really in terms of how am I going to put it? In terms of the location of the antibody, there's no difference really between the enzyme panel detection of antibody and IAT detection of antibody. Two of them are the same. In fact, let me tell you this. Each of the antibody panel cells, if you understand it, okay, because antibody will use different cells. Each of those cells has different companies. That's just what I want you to know. There are different companies, okay? So now, each companies depend on the one that the laboratory is using. So I'm saying that they are all IAT. Because what we're using the cells. We're going to use the cells and use the patient plasma. So we're using the cell to detect the antibody in the patient plasma. So if you are detecting antibody in the patient plasma using a commercially prepared antigen, that is IAT. In fact, another way you can see this is in your blood grouping, you have forward grouping and reverse grouping. So when you say forward grouping, you are detecting the antigen A or B. When you say reverse grouping, you are detecting the antibody A or B, because that antibody is in the plasma. So anytime you are detecting something that is not on the cell, if you are detecting something in the plasma, not on the cell, anytime is indirect or reverse, okay? Anytime you are detecting something on the red blood cells, it is direct or forward. Do you understand me, guys? Okay, so that's what happens. So whether it is enzyme panel or whether it is other type of panel, different company, they may call it IAT. Two of them are still IAT. So enzyme panel is still IAT. The only difference is this: enzyme panels are treated with enzyme, and because of that treatment, they can either enhance some antibody reaction or they can destroy some antibody reaction. And I've mentioned this many times on my previous video that they can destroy maybe MNS and A and B, and of course they can enhance resource antigens or resource antibodies and kidneys antibody. They can enhance those ones. Okay, do you understand me? So the difference between enzyme panel and other IAT is that the enzyme panel are treated with enzyme, and that helps them to either destroy some antibodies or enhance some antibody. That means then, in antibody panel identification, we cannot use enzyme panel as a first line panel. The reason is this: because of the capability of destroying some antibody. Therefore, enzyme panel is mostly used either for confirmatory, test. Okay, so it helps as a confirmatory techniques of perhaps what we've gotten from other type of IAT method. Anyway, I have all of this is on my previous video, so you find out where I've said more about it and listen to it. But anyway, that's what it means. So is there any difference between IAT and indirect Coombs test? The answer is no. There's no difference between indirect antiglobulin test and indirect Coombs test. Two of them are the same. Why? Because they are detecting the antibodies in the plasma. Again, there's no difference between direct antiglobulin test and direct Coombs test. Why? Because two of them are detecting the antibodies on the red cell. I hope that makes sense. All right, let me know what you think about the video. Please, can I ask you to like, share, and comment? Please feel free to, if you appreciate the videos, join the membership just to say thank you, and as the case may be. Anyway, I wish you all the best till I come back away again. Bye-bye.